that just do not make sense. Like why there's so few believers on the firing line, while so many others sit the fence. But if you want to know where the Word of God stands, and believe it wants to use your feet and hands, it's time to take your faith out of the seats and into the streets, and come along with me. If you only look, then you will see on WCNTV.
Well, hello and welcome to a very special edition of WCNTV. We're not usually here on Thursday, but it's a special day and we've got some special guests for you. But before we get into that, I need to plug our big event coming up here in 2 weeks. Jared, our producer, if you can bring up the poster there. It's the annual Ministry Expo and Conference held in Marshfield, Wisconsin. We have a great lineup of speakers. Curtis Bowers, the producer of the Agenda documentaries. Curtis is coming up from Alabama, and we're going to be watching one of his movies, and he'll be doing intro on that on Friday night. And then Saturday, we kick off with Dr. Mike Spalding, Jake McCauley from the Institute on the Constitution, Usama Dakdok, an expert on Islam, Jamie Walden from Omega Dynamics, Lexi Hall from Created Equal, Coach Dave Daubenmeyer from Past the Salt, and David Arthur from I Belong Amen Ministries. If you don't know these folks, look up our information on our website, wisconsinchristiannews.com. Click that red bar, and you'll get all the details. You don't want to miss this event. It's going to be great. We also have national recording artist Leighton Howerton will be there, along with tons of resources that you're going to be able to get. So that is coming up March 13th and 14th, Friday night, all day Saturday, and you want to be there. Thank you. All right, today we have a very special guest, and we're squeezing this program in because time is of the essence. We have with us today Judge Roy Moore from Alabama and Coach Dave Daubenmeyer from Ohio. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Thanks, yes, Rob. I don't know if I got into such exclusive company here, but I appreciate the invite.
Well, you're important. You're an important guy, Coach. Judge Roy is running for U.S. Senate in Alabama, and the primaries are coming up next Tuesday. So we're praying with him and believing for a victory in this election coming up. And we want to talk with him a little bit about things that he's done in the past and what's coming up in the future. So just to give you a little bit of background, Judge Roy received a Bachelor of Science Degree in Arts and Engineering at West Point. He then served as a military police corps in Vietnam. After the Army, he got his law degree at the Alabama School of Law in 1977. He has served the country basically all his life. In 2000, he became judge. He became judge of the 16th Judicial Circuit in Alabama in 1992, and you served there until you became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Alabama in 2000. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. And then probably the incident that made you most famous was the 2003 situation where you were removed from your position as Chief Justice for refusing to remove the Ten Commandments monument in the rotunda of the Alabama Judicial Building. Tell us about that experience. And I know that Coach Dave was there too at the time. And that's kind of when his ministry was just getting started. And
I slept 7 nights.
the whole country was watching. The whole country is watching.
Rob, I slept 7 nights on those steps. That was my first real foray into activist ministry, and that was a time that is so ever frozen in my memory. Some of the great people I met down there, and Judge, the interview that we're doing here today probably would be best done after the election, because there's some really things that I'd like to ask you that I'm not going to put you on the spot here. And I remember the whole Myron Thompson debacle, and I mean, brother, that was an unbelievable time. And had we stood, I've always told people, had we stood stronger, you did all you could, but had the people stood stronger at that point, we may not be where we are today. Judge, what do you think about that?
I don't think we would be, and I think situation, but of course the acknowledgement of God has never been forbidden by our Constitution. In fact, without the acknowledgement of God, we would not have a Constitution. These things are backed up in history and law, and quite frankly, it's just it's unbelievable that the courts are in the stage where they are, that they think it's wrong to acknowledge God. James Madison, our fourth president, writing in Federalist 43, was explaining about Article 7 of the Constitution, when it says the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient to establish the Constitution of the United States. Well, he said in Federalist 43, some of you might wonder, I'm going to paraphrase what he said. I could quote it, but he said, some of you might wonder why we can do this without the concurrence of all 13 states. He said the first question can be answered at once, and I'll quote it. By recurring to the absolute necessity of the case, the great principle of self-preservation, to the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God, which declares that the safety and happiness of society are the objects at which all political institutions aim, to which all such political institutions must be sacrificed. He said basically we would not have a constitution, or we could not have a constitution, but we are entitled to under the laws of nature and nature's God, which is the same thing that Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, in stating why this country came into existence in 1776. Without the acknowledgement of God, we would not understand our form of government. In fact, in 1954, I'll take you to 1954 when they put under God in the pledge. They said at that time that underlying this concept of our American government being founded on the dignity of the individual, he said that history, the human person is important because he was created by God, endowed by him with certain inalienable rights which no civil authority could usurp. The inclusion of God in the pledge, therefore, would further acknowledge the dependence of our people and our government on the moral directions of the Creator. That's what the Legislative Reference Service says, that the congressman wanted in there, the intention of putting God in the pledge to acknowledge where we came from and what our government was about. And certainly we've forgotten that. By the addition of the phrase under God, the consciousness of the American people will be more alerted to the true meaning of our country and its form of government, they said. So without the acknowledgement of God, we wouldn't even understand why we have a government, which includes the First Amendment to the Constitution, prohibits government from interfering how we worship God. We would not have in the 10th Amendment, for example, a recognition that some rights, for example, the acknowledgement of a right to worship God according to dictates of your conscience, cannot be taken by either state government or federal government. The 10th Amendment plainly states that the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states respectively. And then there's 4 little words. It says, or to the people. That means that there's some things that people have that neither state government or federal government can have, and it's recognized in our First Amendment. And that's the freedom of conscience to worship God. Now, to take that away, courts aren't just violating the Constitution. They're violating the law of God. They're violating the law that upon which our Constitution was founded. They're violating everything about our country. Without God, we have no moral direction. In 1954, they specifically put in there that By turning to God, putting in God in the pledge, they recognized the direction or moral direction from the Creator. It said, more importantly, the children of our land in the daily recitation of the pledge of school will be daily impressed with the true understanding of our way of life and its origins. By the addition of the phrase under God in the pledge, the consciousness of the American people will be more alerted to the true meaning of our country and its form of government. Throughout this, they recognized that we needed God to prevent our nation from becoming more communistic. Well, today that same thing is happening in our country, and we don't realize how to stop it. That's what they did in 1954. The whole point in putting under God in the pledge was stated in the legislative history. And I want to read something to you. At this moment of our history, the principles underlying our American government and American way of life are under attack by a system whose philosophy is at direct odds with our own. They were talking about communism at that time. Today we're talking about socialism, which communism is just another form of socialism. And we don't know how to stop it. The Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, thinks that party politics can stop it. That won't stop it. The only thing that will stop it is a recognition that our true source of strength and security is in God. And when we turn back to God, then we'll stop this socialism movement that's about to take over our country. Coach, I appreciate you being here because you're a real patriot. I do appreciate what you did coming here on the Ten Commandments when they were removed from the court. Since that time, we've seen a moral declination of our country. We've seen mass shootings come into being. We've seen shootings in malls and churches, and we've seen atrocities that, well, we've seen immorality seep into our whole political system. We're now talking about transgender rights. We're talking about GLBT agenda. We're talking about two men getting married in the place of a man and a woman. That was not God's plan, and that's not what we were under for 250 years.
Judge, Rob, if I could, real quick, Judge, I've been thinking as you've been running through this whole thing about, of course, Everson versus the Board of Education. That was like 47, I think, and then so all of a sudden they want to put the pledge in. That's 54. Nobody's screaming separation in church and state at that point. And then we know that all of a sudden, once they got that kind of ingrained in the law, judges, it now that the judges, the Supreme Court justices, the whatever, do they not believe that we were built on a Christian foundation, or is it that lie of stare decisis, previously decided case law? Do they now look at that and say, yeah, I believe we were founded based on Christian principles, but the courts have ruled? Is that what's happened to us, Judge?
Well, the courts are a big part of the apathy and apostasy, I should say, of this country. They're the ones that have confused the word religion and God. And religion was not God. Religion was defined as the duties we owed to God and the manner of discharging those duties. But another note in that 54 case, and I've got the legislative history in my hand, said it should be pointed out that the adoption of this legislation in no way runs contrary to the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Now listen to this. Listen to this statement. This is not an act establishing a religion or one interfering with the free exercise of religion. A distinction must be made between the existence of religion as an institution and a belief in the sovereignty of God. That's what the Supreme Court doesn't understand today. That's what the United States Congress said in 1954. A distinction must be made between the existence of religion as an institution and a belief in the sovereignty of God. We were founded on the sovereignty of God. Washington's first address, his first inaugural address, recognized that. His first proclamation said, whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor. We've got to recognize that God is essential to this country in our form of government, not just giving us morality, which is enough, not just having his hand of providence over our nation, which is certainly good, but it's necessary to recognize God to find out our form of government, which restricts the government from taking away our inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are not within the power of government to take away without just cause, without due process. We've got to recognize that certainly there's no due process in taking a child's life in the womb. How could the child even represent himself? This is something that we've got to go back to, is the recognition of God.
Well, Judge Roy also has published the book, excellent book, So Help Me God. And I would encourage you all to get a copy of that, available on Amazon. I'm sure that's where everybody gets their books nowadays, but he goes over many of these things. And let me just ask, though, going back 17 years, it's hard to believe it's been 17 years, but who was behind the demand that the monument be removed? I mean,
Well,
how did that all go?
It's all due with liberal philosophy like the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and people like
Right
that.
there in Montgomery, right, Judge? It's right there it's right.
That's right. Southern Poverty Law Center.
Yeah, it's right there.
Look, adjacent to the Supreme Court. They're building it there. And they vowed not to have anything about God in the court. Of course, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't put a monument or anything else. You're not establishing a religion, and that's exactly what the Congress said in 1954. I think most people in our country acknowledge a God. They acknowledge the Ten Commandments. They recognize that historically that meant a lot to our country. And in fact, the two tables of the law contained in the Ten Commandments represent our religion and morality. Washington said that the dictionary in 1828 defined religion as under the first table of the Ten Commandments, and morality or virtue under the second table of the Ten Commandments. The six commandments following the first four. And Washington said in his farewell address, he said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, now we're getting to politics, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connection with private and public felicity or happiness. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in our courts of justice? Then in the next two sentences, he says something so very relevant to our country today. He says, let us with caution, that means be careful, let us with caution to indulge the fact that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, in other words, no matter how smart you get or how many degrees you have after your name, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. In other words, without the acknowledgement of God, we will have an immoral national society. And what do you think we've got today? The first thing that happens when they have mass shootings, they run to try to take away your inalienable rights. You take rights under the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. That's not what causes deaths. It's the person pulling the trigger. It's the morality of that person. You know, when I was a kid, we used to, a child, I should say, when I was a child, we went to school. People brought shotguns in their trucks. They had loaded weapons on the school ground. Nobody had killings back then. Nobody had problems in the malls and in the shopping places. Those things are caused by people, not guns. Guns don't kill people any more than a car kills a person, or a knife, or whatever.
Well, you know, Judge Roy, in those days, we also had intact families, and we had pastors not afraid to preach the truth from the pulpit.
That's right.
So
Exactly.
American Christianity has fundamentally changed over the last 2 or maybe 3 generations. So,
but all that's taken away God. All it's taken away our morality. And you see it, and you look at the United States Congress today. Do you think that's not a corrupt group?
Mm.
They can't agree on anything. They can't see any benefit for our country together. It's all fighting.
We were trying to figure out before the show what in the world they have been doing. What do they do all year?
They,
You know,
I tell you what they do. They fight over power. Who's going to contain the power? You know, the very strange thing about that is that the Constitution is all about restricting human power. It's about restrict separation of powers, checks and balances, the 10th Amendment. All these things were to restrain human power. In fact, Madison said it this way. He said, what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. And if angels were to govern men, neither external or internal controls would be necessary. The greatest difficulty in framing a form of government of men over men is this. First, you must enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Our problem in government today is government is not obliged to control itself. Neither the executive, the legislative, or the judicial branch of government is controlling itself. Judges make law. That's how we got same-sex marriage. It wasn't because of Congress. Congress passed a bill in 1996 called Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA. It was struck down in 2013 by United States Supreme Court that said Congress had no business in this area. It was left to the states. 2 years later, they overturned the constitutions of all the states to declare same-sex marriage. Now, if Congress didn't have the authority, where did the Supreme Court of the United States get that authority to interfere with marriage? Certainly they didn't have it. And certainly they did something illicit, something that's causing a destruction of our country and our families, as you mentioned. And now a reproach upon our right to believe in God according to the dictates of our conscience. We have numerous cases before the Supreme Court right now where they're trying to find out if a transgender has a right that overcomes the right of a funeral home director who hired him to be a man, and he turns out he wanted to be a woman, and closed down the funeral home so that he could have what he wanted in his mind. And that case is before the United States Supreme Court today. So we better pray that the United States Supreme Court wakes up to the reality that our rights don't come from what we think. It comes from what God gave us.
Judge, I don't want to lure you into a trap here, but that's something that's kind of fascinated me. You're a beloved guy down in Alabama. I mean, you really are. Maybe not as much as you were 17 years ago, but people know they know Roy Moore. They know who you are. And what happened to you during the last election? They Kavanaugh'd you, right? I mean, they didn't have that name then, but they did that. Evidently, Judge, without getting yourself in any trouble, there must have been
in trouble.
Really powerful forces that did not want to see you in the United States Senate. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's very open. They were blatant about it. They came out, before these false allegations came out and said that the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, said, we don't need another conservative rebel in the Senate that we can't manage. Well, they know they can't manage me because I've lost my job twice, standing for principles which not only are legal, but which the people of Alabama and the people of America have celebrated for 250 years. They don't want me up there because they're afraid I would embarrass them. Embarrass them perhaps because I would acknowledge God. And they don't think that's proper in government to acknowledge God. I'm going to tell you, it's not only proper, it's necessary, it's essential that we get back to recognition that there is a power higher than us upon which gives us our morality, and all our founding fathers spoke of this. I mean, you could go through a litany of quotes and documentation about this. Why they don't want to do that? In 2004, 2005, after I got removed from the Supreme Court of Alabama, we passed into legislative hands two bills, one bill called the Constitutional Restoration Act. It was filed both in 2004 and 2005, which would restore the right to acknowledge God by taking it out of the hands of judges and taking their rulings from interpretation out of foreign law and placing it back in the Constitution. But you don't find people today in Congress, or at least in the House, that want to acknowledge God. I shouldn't say that applies to everybody. It doesn't. But a great majority think that recognition of God is illegal. You can't do it. And I submit to you that you can't recognize our Constitution or our laws without acknowledging there's a God upon whom they were founded.
So
that's where we get the First Amendment.
They were concerned that you might become the conscience of the Senate, and they were pretty content with the conscience they already had. Would you agree with that, Judge?
Yeah, they want to keep dividing people. They all want a quest for power. Now, if you ask me, politicians that go to Washington, I don't care whether it's from Alabama, Minnesota, Wisconsin, or anywhere, they say one thing to the people, they get up there and they do another. They become part of a swamp. They become, if you call it a swamp, you call it quicksand's more appropriate term. They get up there and they're sucked into the lust for power, lust for money. John, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world.
Rock and roll, right? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Well, it's
the lust of the world, pride of life. Yes, sir.
And they want to keep their job. And you talk about term limits, you talk about a balanced budget. Do you think any congressman's going up there and put before that body that they want term limits? They would eject them immediately. Or balanced budget. Their job up there is to spend. The more they spend, the more they think they can keep people happy and keep their job. We've got to get back to recognition. It's not about keeping a job. It's about serving the people. It's about serving society. We all know that families are the backbone of the country. And if we destroy the families, we've got cases up at the Supreme Court right now where Catholics don't want to sign over their rights to acknowledge God and have to give people contraceptives and allow abortions in their health policies. They don't want to have Christian organizations that have to give children to two homosexuals. We have got a problem, and it's not going away by not talking about it. I, for one, am talking about it. Yes, I've received a lot of opposition. I get probably on this show you'll receive a great deal. But that's the problem. We're afraid to stand up anymore. Stand up for what we believe, what our forefathers believe, what our fathers believe, what our grandfathers believe. We've got to get back.
What do you feel has caused that, Judge Roy? What's made us so timid and so apathetic?
Well, because we've forgotten how to serve God. That's our only purpose on life, is to serve God. And that's why I seek the United States Senate to do the will of God. I don't seek the Senate for my own benefit. I'd rather stay at home and fish.
You're the only one that I know that's out there that's actually saying the word of God and standing on biblical principles.
But you'll find
are literally the only one that I know that's out there doing that in the political realm.
Well, you find so many people running for office, and all they do is they show that they're carrying a Bible out of the church, and they're politicking. They'll say, "I'm a strong conservative Christian," if they want to say that. But basically, when they get up there, they don't do anything to restore the acknowledgement of God. I have already done that. I have not only put the Ten Commandments in the Supreme Court and been dismissed twice. I got elected after the first time I was dismissed. And the second time I took a stand against same-sex marriage. Legal stand. I wrote an opinion called API. And in that opinion, I recognized that the Supreme Court was off the rocker. I didn't say it like that. But, just didn't know 5 people in the Supreme Court changed an institution that existed for 250 years or longer than that in society, thousands of years. Most countries still recognize that institution. We've got to recognize that what we're doing in this country is not law. It's ruling by the will of man, not the will of God. And until we do that, and I really feel sorry for people that elect people that they think are good Christian people. They'll get in Washington. They don't mention anything about God.
Mm-hmm. You know, a couple, 3
Well,
years,
you know, again, no, go ahead, Coach.
I'm sorry, Rob. A couple, 3 years ago, Judge, I got actively involved with Kim Davis, what was going on down there in Kentucky. And as for those who maybe don't remember, Kim Davis was the county clerk who said, I'm not going to sign marriage licenses for homosexuals. And Judge, when we went down there and we did like Gideon, we made a lot of noise and shined a lot of light. The truth of the matter is, Kim Davis was the only one in that whole mess who was obeying the law, because the law in the state of Kentucky said that a marriage was a union between one man and one woman. And then she kept asking, and I wish she had followed further on with it. We went down and we said, show us the law. With your good buddy, Michael Perutka, by the way, show us the law. Just show us the law that Kim Davis is defying. And Judge, there isn't a law.
Well, you know, I'm glad they didn't have me there. I'd still be in jail. I you know, all I can say is they tried to have a federal judge tell me to disobey the United States Constitution. He said, while the Chief Justice is free to keep whatever religious belief he chooses, the state may not acknowledge the sovereignty of the Judeo-Christian God and attribute to that God a religious freedom. That's the most stupid statement I have ever heard anyone make. Joseph Story, in his commentaries on the Constitution, says, the rights of conscience are indeed beyond the reach of any human power.
Amen.
They are given by God and cannot be encroached upon by any human authority without a criminal disobedience of the precepts of natural as well as of revealed religion. Joseph Story was a justice under Chief Justice John Marshall. He wrote the commentaries to John Marshall to honor him. And he quoted in the First Amendment section that the rights of conscience come from God, not from man. And for a federal judge to say that that's wrong, somebody need to review his decision, but they didn't.
In 2016, when you were literally the only one standing up against Obergefell, where were the Christians standing with you?
They're in their.
I know there were a handful. I know Coach was there.
There were people, but you didn't find the politicians coming out doing it. And the point is that decision by the Supreme Court violated everything about precedent, everything historically about God in our country. And, you know, when men put themselves above God, they violate everything that our Constitution stands for. I recall a passage in Isaiah says that wherefore the Lord said, for as much as this people draw near me with their mouth and honoreth me with their lips, but have removed their heart from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men, therefore will I proceed to do a marvelous work. Even a marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and their understanding and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid. We had a lot of men with a prudent understanding that was hiding it. And we've got to start standing up for what we believe and what we know is true. It's not illegal.
You won't say this, Judge. I'm going to say this because the work that I currently try to do in trying to wake up the church, the clergy has been a great failure. You don't have to say it, Judge. I'm saying it. And the clergy has not shown their fealty to Christ by defending the very precepts of Christ, the protection of the unborn children, the protection of marriage. We could just run down a litany of things. And Jesus said that we Christians were the salt of the earth. We were. And so we have to understand that the enemy is not going to be salt. They're going to do everything they can to destroy it. And as a result, somewhere along the line, the men of God have taken the church and they've taken it. The Bible says that no one sets a light up on a hill and then puts a bushel basket over the top of it. But Judge, wouldn't you agree that's really what we've done in our churches? The churches are not standing up and shining a light to the community and saying, Judge Moore's right. Judge Moore's right. We stand with Judge Moore publicly.
Well, you know, it might be a lot like I said earlier, they love the power and the money, and churches to become bastions of keeping people there by not talking about sin, because that offends people. And if you want people, just promise them prosperity, more money, if they believe in God, that God will give them money to make them happy. That's not the way God works. You could learn that very simply. Bible says very clearly, no man can serve two masters, for either he hate the one, love the other, he hold the one, despite the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. The problem is most of our politicians, most of our clergy are serving mammon. I'm not saying all of them. There's good people out there, but they've got to learn to stand up and get this notion that separation of church and state does not mean, listen very clearly, separating God from government. That is the most foolish concept. Even Jefferson in his letter said, believing with you that religion is a man, he said, believing with you that religion is a matter between man and his God, I regard with sovereign reverence that act of the Holy. He said, believing with you that religion is a matter between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I regard with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people that declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an established religion, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Now, he didn't separate God from state. He said the power of government rests in actions, not what you believe. But today, we've separated it, because we think any mention of God is a violation of separation of church and state. Jefferson knew very well that God gave us religious liberty. And even before, yes, Jefferson had slaves at one time, but he fought against the extension of slavery in the Northwest Territory and lost by one vote. And he said this, can the liberties of a nation, and it's true today, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we remove their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God, that they're not to be violated, but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and his justice cannot sleep forever. And it didn't sleep forever. We had a civil war, if you'll recall, in the 1860s, about 80 years later after he said this. And he recognized then, if we stop recognizing our gifts, our rights come from God, then we're going to lose our rights. And look what's happened. When they said the right of privacy, Griswold versus Connecticut in 1961, I believe it was. The right of privacy. And now it's come to the right to abort your child. And that's not murder. By whose definition? Life began in the immediate gift of God, a right inherent nature in every individual. It begins in contemplation of law as soon as the infant stirs in its mother's womb. That was the definition that they went by when they put the right to life in the 5th and 14th Amendment. When they recognized we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That life began in the womb by all the definitions of our founding fathers. How can we say it doesn't? So abortion is illegal, but the Supreme Court has made it so, made it legal. You know, if they change the meaning of a word, they can change the whole thing. And when they change the word of God to religion, Christians sat still, did nothing. God is not religion. Religions were the duties you owe to God. And if you put that in the First Amendment, if you put the definition that they used, that Madison used in his memorial remonstrance, that Story used in his commentaries on the Constitution, if you put that definition in the First Amendment, it reads like this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of the duties you owe to the Creator in the manner of discharging it, or prohibiting the free exercise of the duties you owe to the Creator in the manner of discharging it. It's all about God. The First Amendment religion clauses were all about God. Now they say the acknowledgement of God is a violation. That's why they took the Ten Commandments out. That's why they took the Ten Commandments out. That's why they took prayer out of school.
You know, Judge, I also, sorry, Rob, I also heard him say, Judge, that, well, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that's organic law. That's mentioned in the Declaration, but that's not really constitutional law. I had somebody point out to me that the preborn are represented in the Constitution in the preamble, to ourselves and to our posterity. Now, you look it up wherever you want to. Posterity means what, Judge? Those yet to be born. So therefore, the Constitution directly applies to those who are yet unborn, just as it's listed in the term posterity. So they've twisted it so many different ways, and we just haven't been as quick on our feet as they have. We haven't untwisted it as fast as they twist it.
You know, all you have to look at the Declaration of Independence and read it. And after that, it says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of people to alter, abolish it, and to create new government.
Yeah.
It says that the only role of government is to secure the rights that God gave us. That's the Declaration of Independence. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from consent of the governed. That is our organic document in Wisconsin, in Florida, in Texas, in Mississippi, in California, in New York.
Ohio.
All corporations begin with two documents. Charter of incorporation gives their name and purpose, and the bylaws which give power of government. That's what the state taxes you on. That's what they did in the Declaration of Independence. They didn't create a corporation. They created a government by laying its foundations on the principles of the Declaration that God gives us a right to these things. He gives us a right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And government's role is to secure those rights for us. Not from us, for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what they don't do. They take them from us.
Amen.
And they're violating the very purpose of the United States. The powers of government were laid in the Articles of Confederation, which later became the Constitution of the United States. That's powers of government. But the principles are what's important, because the powers mean nothing without the principles. We're violating the powers and we're violating the principles. And we need to get back to constitutional government. That's why I'm running for the United States Senate. And that's why I will acknowledge God. And I don't care. I don't care what conflict that causes people. But we will not restore a moral society until we do. Washington said
No,
that.
it's impossible. It's impossible.
Said that you can't have a moral
And
society.
those who call themselves Christians all around this country should be grateful to God that you have the courage to be doing what you're doing right now. Unfortunately, they don't understand 2020 is a pivotal year. Can you imagine Mayor Pete in the White House? And I'm predicting today that he's going to be the candidate for the Democrats, because they're going to set, he's their dream candidate, and they're going to set him against Donald Trump, and Donald Trump with his, he's not afraid to say what he thinks. He's not going to be allowed to bring out, the real truth behind Mayor Pete, and the sodomy issue. I'll just go ahead and say it, the sodomy issue. Can you imagine Trump being in that position to have to go that direction? He's not going to be able to do it.
Can you imagine a country with a president that has a man for the first lady?
Amazing.
A president who's the wife, yeah.
Or a vice versa.
Mayor Pete identifies as the wife in that couple.
Yeah. So, it is a ridiculous situation. All that purpose, the whole purpose behind Pete Buttigieg is to start this conversation, to get this introduced, because it's coming. Unless we go back to God, it will come. Unless our nation turns, unless the Republican Party starts to recognize those principles upon which it was founded.
Well, Judge, again, I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you, because you're in a race now, and you're in a race from, as a guy in Ohio who looks down there, Coach Tommy Tuberville's in the race, and Jeff Sessions, who a lot of this stuff happened under Jeff Sessions' watch, as he was already seated in the U.S. Senate. Seems like three decent guys. How Doug Jones, out of the four of you guys, how Doug Jones would ever get that position is really, really pretty amazing. What, other than what we've been speaking about here, Judge, what separates you from those guys, from Jeff Sessions and from Tommy Tuberville?
Well, I don't want to talk about my opponents. I think I'm recognized that I have been sworn to the Constitution since I went into West Point in 1965. In 1969, I graduated, and shortly I found myself in Vietnam, where some of my soldiers and some of my classmates were killed, standing for what this country was for and was based upon, defending the United States Constitution. We need to go back to the Constitution. We need to recognize it's a separation of powers, and there's checks on the powers, that government shouldn't be making laws through administrative agencies without any control of Congress. So the United States Supreme Court should be uttering laws that they say even the Congress can't make, as they did in 2013. We need to go back and recognize that it's a nation on a foundation that if we destroy its basis, we're going to be destroyed from within. We're not going to be destroyed from without. Russia, China, no country will defeat us unless we give it up from within, as did the Roman empires, did so many other countries and nations. We need to go back and recognize that God is our only source of security and real security. I mean, look what happens when the Twin Towers fell. Congress got on the steps and started praying. Well, who were they praying to? They were praying to God. That's the same thing Franklin Delano Roosevelt prayed to on the eve of breaking into Normandy, the invasion of Normandy. We need to recognize that God has always been. Washington recognized it in every battle he ever fought. We've got to recognize that God is our strength and security. And it's a strength. It forms the basis of our homes, our families, children coming up need to be advised about the Constitution. I think that separates me from some of the candidates. I won't say all, but I'll say some of the candidates. Other things that separate me, I'm a military veteran. I know about war. Congress declares war. And we certainly should have people in Congress that know the results and the consequences of war before we declare it. Not that we shouldn't or that we should, but somebody needs to know about that. I've also been a judge. I know about judges that don't understand what precedent really means. You can look it up in history. Precedent didn't exclude God. It was an established rule to abide by former precedents where the same points come again in litigation as well, to keep the scale of justice even and steady and not allowed to waver with every new judge's opinion. But this rule of precedent admits of exception. Now, this is right in the law of Blackstone, which forms the basis of our law. This is what precedent meant when they had law in this country from the outset. It's an exception. It is an exception that, yet the exception, I'm going to have to look it up. I can't remember, but it basically says an exception is when they violate the laws of God. There's a higher law, and that's an exception. You can't have a precedent that violates it. Yet this rule admits of exception where the former determination is most evidently contrary to reason, much more to be contrary to the divine law. That's the exact wording. It took me a while to remember it, but yet this rule of precedent admits of exception where the former determination is most evidently contrary to reason, much more if it be contrary to the divine law. Obergefell failed both tests. It was contrary to reason in the first place. It wasn't historically based, and it violated divine law. God gave us the right to marry. The church, it was established first as the church, and then governments took it over. Now governments have just completely redefined it. But that's
and by that decision, they overturned, I don't know how many states' constitutional amendments. We worked very hard here in Wisconsin, passing a constitutional amendment to protect marriage.
Let me tell you a secret, okay? This is something that most legalists don't admit if they know it. The United States Supreme Court knows it. Ruth Bader Ginsburg knows it. She wrote an opinion recognizing it, that state judges have just as much authority under the Constitution to rule on constitutional issues as does the federal courts of appeals.
I believe it.
But when you don't believe it, you can go back to 1993 in Lockhart versus Fretwell, and I'm quoting Justice Thomas, where he said that while federal supremacy may mean something in federal laws overriding state laws, the fact that in our federal system, a state trial court's interpretation of a federal constitutional issue is just as authoritative as the federal court of appeals in whose circuit the state trial court is situated. What does that mean? It's a fulfillment of Article 6 of the Constitution. This Constitution and the laws of the United States made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Then it says this, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or the laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding, which means that state judges have just as much authority. Now, we exercise that principle in Alabama when Judge Callie Grenade, a federal district judge, declared our constitutional amendment of traditional marriage to be unconstitutional. She didn't have a probate judge in her authority or under that case. And so API, Religious Liberty Council, filed a case for API in Alabama, and our state Supreme Court ruled, with me absent because my memorandum was in question, that I'd given probate judges not to follow that order. They ruled that marriage was only between man and woman under our law, and that they issued injunctions in that case. And then my memorandum was affirmed, basically. Callie Grenade actually recognized she couldn't order the probate judges in that case and hold them in contempt because she didn't have any probate judges under her. So then Obergefell ruled, and our state Supreme Court issued an opinion or issued a directive to the parties to brief the effect of Obergefell on their opinion upholding traditional marriage in their injunctions. Well, they sat after the parties did issue briefing on the matter. They sat on it for 8 months until I made them rule. I entered the case again because it was a different issue. My memorandum wasn't in question anymore. And a different issue had arisen, the effect of Obergefell. And they ruled. They dismissed pending motions and petitions, which allowed most people to think they dismissed the case. They didn't. They affirmed the case and affirmed the injunctions. They exist today, but you don't see anybody standing for them. You don't see anybody standing up for them, either probate judges or anybody, because they don't want to appear to violate the Supreme Court. Well, guess what? Alabama Supreme Court hadn't been overruled by any federal court. Yes, it could be overruled by the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court hadn't taken their case. So today, those injunctions still exist in Alabama, but nobody's doing anything about them.
So gay marriage, homosexual marriage, technically then, Judge, is not legal in the state of Alabama. Is that what you're saying?
Technically, the Supreme Court of Alabama's ruling stands till it's overruled by the United States Supreme Court, period.
Wow.
Now, yes, not the 11th Circuit. No, somebody in the 11th Circuit is listening because they know, just like I know, that a state Supreme Court ruling, and everybody that's gone to law school knows this, is appealable to the United States Supreme Court, not to a federal district court, not to a court of appeals. And that happened in 20-something states before it got to Alabama, and the Supreme Court stood by and let it happen. Nobody said anything. Nobody appealed it to the Supreme Court. I guess they had a right not to do anything. But certainly in Alabama, we stood up and we made a ruling, and it has not been overruled. Wow. The United States Supreme Court in Obergefell covered only certain states in the Sixth Circuit. That's what the junctions issued. So until that, it could be taken to the United States Supreme Court, but you can't find anybody with.
You know, I'd heard that, Judge. So the Obergefell ruling only applies to the states in the Sixth Circuit. I'd heard
it's a precedent of the Supreme Court, which they can, each state, if they were to oppose it, unless it's been ruled by a federal district court in that circuit or state Supreme Court, it can still be contested. It doesn't automatically become law. That would be a violation of the whole structure. They ruled on the Sixth Circuit. Now, federal district courts and other state Supreme Courts too can recognize that as precedent if they want to, but they don't have to. Even in Ohio, that was recognized that the federal district court then adopted the Supreme Court and then could rule on it in a state matter that was brought to them. But in Alabama, the Alabama Supreme Court's decision, if you go look at the final order, they upheld the injunctions in the final order of the case. Nobody's overruled that case.
Unbelievable.
It's
I did not know that.
It's believable because it's true.
Yeah, no, I believe you. I mean,
And yet you were suspended
Yeah.
over this.
I was suspended after that for supposedly telling the probate judges to disobey a federal court order, which I did not do. In fact, after API was issued, the Supreme Court of Alabama issued the injunctions. I simply advised the probate judges that they were under a legal obligation to recognize the Alabama Supreme Court's injunctions. I did not tell them to disobey any order. I said, I can't tell you what to do. In fact, my memorandum, I said, I can't tell you what to do. I can only tell you that you're under a legal obligation to recognize the Alabama Supreme Court injunctions until they rule. Well, they didn't rule for 8 months. And then when they did rule, they dismissed pending motions and petitions. It had nothing to do with the injunctions that they issued. And it's in the final order. And nobody on that court or any court can argue with the law. It's there.
Well, Judge, we're winding down here to the last couple of minutes. What would you like to leave our viewers with, and how can people across the country help you in this race at this point?
Well, if anybody wants to know what we're doing in the campaign, they can go to roymore.org. They can see the Pelosi smear. I didn't talk much about the false allegations, but in September of 2017, before the false allegations came out, they had started disinformation campaign using Russian tactics and people from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence staffers, Jonathan Morgan and New Knowledge, Reed Hoffman, who caused so much trouble in Iowa, put $750,000 and admitted it. They've all admitted it. They all admitted it's false. They all admitted it's wrong. But I lost the election, and they don't really care. What I would want people to remember is that we've got, as a nation, to go back to God, not because of me, not because of what I say. roymore.org is our website, and you can find more about our campaign and what we're doing. In fact, we've just released today, this evening, it's going to be a video on abortion, and I think you ought to see it. It's very interesting. It brings out the differences between myself and Doug Jones, the Democrat who won. And how
I think is that on your website now?
It should be on the website now. If it's not, it will be this evening.
Could we just play that, Jared? It's only 30 seconds.
Yeah, have you got it? Yeah, look and see if you got it.
Yeah, it's right there. It's 30 seconds. Let's
It's only
watch
30
it.
seconds.
he's getting it ready.
Yep, just got to wait for it to load.
An unborn child forms fingerprints at 10 weeks, starts to dream at 18 weeks, hears mother's voice at 25 weeks. Doug Jones wants abortion to be allowed until the moment before birth.
Do you think abortion should be banned after 5 months?
As I said, what a stupid question.
Doug Jones votes to force taxpayers to fund abortion.
The God who gave us the 10 Commandments is the same God that gave us the right to life, and I will always defend that right. I'm Judge Roy Moore, and I approve this message.
There's your choice, Christians. What you going to do? The election is March 3rd, next week, Tuesday. We're going to be praying for you and with you, Judge Roy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're a hero. You're a hero, Judge. You know,
Absolutely.
Coach Dave's a hero. I'll leave the hero to him.
the truth is, brother, you laid your job on the line twice. I don't know anybody that'll lay their job on the line once. And
Well, people need to look at not what politicians say. They need to look at what they do, what they've stood for, and what they've done in office, not what they say they're going to do.
right.
Well, I've admired you since I first heard about you 20 years ago. So, like I said, God bless you, Judge, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Folks,
Thank you.
next week, Wednesday, we have J.R. Harrison from the Natural Family Foundation. The following week, we have Ray Comfort from Living Waters Ministries. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining us. Have a good day.